When I was 23, my whole world shattered. My mother, Helen, died in a tragic accident, a car crash caused by a reckless driver who ran a red light. One moment she was alive, sending me a text about what we'd have for dinner, and the next she was gone. Just like that. The grief swallowed me whole. I wasn't just mourning my mother, I was mourning the version of myself that existed when she was alive. She had always been my biggest supporter, my safe place, my home. Without her, everything felt cold and unfamiliar. My father, Michael, was devastated too, but he processed his grief differently. He buried himself in work, avoiding conversations that forced him to acknowledge the depth of our loss. Meanwhile, I clung to everything that reminded me of her. The photos, her favorite perfume bottle, the old sweater she used to wear around the house. It was my way of keeping her close. 3 years later, my father remarried. Her name was Linda, and from the very first moment I met her, something felt off. She was a tall, sharp-featured woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a permanent look of mild disapproval. She was 46, divorced, and had no children of her own. My father met her at a business event, and their relationship progressed quickly. Too quickly. Before I knew it, she had moved into our family home, the same house my mother had filled with warmth and laughter. I tried to be open-minded. I really did. But Linda made it impossible. She wasn't openly cruel, at least not at first. Instead, she operated in subtle ways, with carefully placed remarks that chipped away at me. If I mentioned my mother in conversation, she'd sigh loudly and change the subject. If I left framed photos of Mom on the mantel, she'd rearrange the furniture so they were no longer visible. One time, I found a picture of Mom and me from my college graduation stuffed into a drawer. When I confronted Linda about it, she gave me a tight-lipped smile and said, "You need to stop living in the past, Sarah. It's not healthy." I knew what she was really saying. Your mother is gone. Get over it. My father never defended me. He was a man who avoided conflict at all costs, and Linda knew it. She manipulated that weakness, ensuring that any disagreement between us became a Sarah problem, rather than something worth addressing. If I complained about her dismissiveness, he'd just say, "She's trying, sweetheart. Can't you meet her halfway?" But Linda wasn't trying. She was replacing. She changed the house piece by piece, erasing traces of my mother's presence. The floral curtains Mom had picked out? Gone. The bookshelf filled with her favorite novels? Replaced with minimalist decor. Even the kitchen, Mom's sacred space, where she taught me how to cook, was transformed. Linda had the cabinets repainted, threw out the ceramic mugs my mother had collected from our travels, and filled the pantry with food my mother would never have bought. The final straw came when she tried to throw out my mother's old jewelry box. I caught her in the act one Saturday afternoon, pulling it out from the closet with a trash bag in hand. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped, my voice shaking. She raised an eyebrow, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Sarah, it's been 3 years. You don't need to hoard all of this." I grabbed the box from her hands, my grip tight. "This isn't hoarding. This is my mother's." Linda crossed her arms. "Your father and I are building a new life together. You're stuck in the past, and honestly, it's exhausting." I was seething. My hands were shaking. "You don't get to decide how I grieve." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You act like you're the only one who's ever lost someone. People move on, Sarah. You should try it sometime." I wanted to scream at her, but instead, I turned on my heel and went straight to my father. I told him everything. How she belittled my grief. How she was trying to erase Mom's memory. How she had the audacity to throw away something so precious to me. His response? A sigh. A tired, weary sigh. "Sarah, I know this is hard for you," he said, rubbing his temples. "But Linda is my wife now. She's not trying to hurt you. She is hurting me." I yelled, my voice breaking. "And you just sit there and let her." He wouldn't even look me in the eye. "I just want peace in this house." I felt sick. He wasn't on my side. He never would be. That night, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, not when it no longer felt like home. I stayed with my best friend Rachel for a while, and eventually I got my own place. My relationship with my father became distant, reduced to occasional phone calls filled with awkward silences. Linda had one. She had successfully pushed me out. But she would never erase my mother. No matter how many pictures she hid, no matter how many memories she tried to suffocate, my mother lived in me. And no one could take that away. Every year, on the anniversary of my mother's death, I visited her grave. It was the one tradition I refused to let go of, no matter how much Linda tried to act like my mother had never existed. I would buy fresh lilies, her favorite, drive to the cemetery, and sit by her headstone, talking to her like I used to when she was alive. This year was no different. I woke up early, got dressed in something simple but respectful, and made my way to the kitchen to grab my car keys. Linda was there, sipping coffee at the table, scrolling through her phone with her usual expression of mild disinterest. My father sat across from her, silent as always, reading the newspaper as if the date meant nothing to him. I ignored them at first, heading toward the door, but Linda's voice stopped me. "Where are you going this early?" I turned to face her, gripping my keys tightly. "To the cemetery. It's Mom's anniversary." She made a noise, somewhere between a scoff and a laugh, and set her coffee cup down. "Oh, Sarah, don't you think this whole performance is a little dramatic?" I felt my chest tighten. "Excuse me." Linda leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You do this every year. Sitting at a grave, talking to a headstone like it's going to answer you? It's childish. She shook her head, almost amused. People die. That's life. You don't see me crying over my parents every year. I could feel my blood boiling, but before I could say anything, I looked at my father. He hadn't said a word. He just sat there, eyes glued to the newspaper, pretending not to hear. You have nothing to say? I asked him, my voice shaking. He sighed but didn't meet my gaze. Sarah, I just don't want another argument. That was it. That was all he ever said when it came to Linda. He didn't care how much she disrespected me, how much she tried to erase my mother. He just wanted peace, even if it meant sacrificing me. I clenched my jaw. Right. Of course. God forbid Linda experiences a little discomfort. Linda smirked. Oh, come on. I'm just saying it like it is. You need to move on. Normal people don't wallow in grief for years. I couldn't trust myself to speak without screaming, so I turned on my heel and walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, the morning air crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and flowers left by other mourners. I walked up to my mother's grave, my hands shaking as I knelt down and placed the lilies beside her name. Helen Carter. Beloved mother and wife. I ran my fingers over the carved letters, the cold stone grounding me as tears blurred my vision. I miss you so much, I whispered. I wish you were here. I stayed there for over an hour, talking to her, letting myself feel everything I couldn't in that house. The grief, the anger, the loneliness. I told her how much I hated Linda, how my father had let me down again, how exhausting it was to pretend I was okay when I wasn't. By the time I left, my face was streaked with tears, but my heart felt lighter. I didn't care what Linda thought. This wasn't childish drama. It was love. And love didn't just disappear because someone was gone. A week later, Linda's dog Baxter died. I should have felt bad, I really should have. But after what she said to me, after all the ways she had dismissed my grief, it was hard to summon any sympathy. She was inconsolable. She spent the entire day crying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket like she had lost a child. My father hovered over her, bringing her tea, rubbing her back, whispering soft reassurances. That night, she announced that she would be holding a memorial for the dog. A memorial? I almost laughed out loud. She sent out invitations. Actual invitations. She had a framed picture of Baxter on the mantel, complete with candles and flowers. She invited her friends, who showed up dressed in black, murmuring condolences as if she had lost a spouse instead of a dog. At dinner that night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. So let me get this straight, I said, setting my fork down. You mocked me for mourning my mother, but now you expect us all to play along while you hold a funeral for your dog? Linda's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me. I gestured around the room. This whole thing. The invitations, the candlelit shrine, the so sorry for your lost messages. How is this acceptable? But visiting my mother's grave once a year is childish drama. Her face turned red. That is not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing, I shot back. Except my mother was a person. Baxter was a dog. Linda's mouth fell open in shock, and for the first time in my life, my father actually intervened. Sarah, that's enough, he said sharply. I turned to him, my hands trembling. Oh, now you speak up? When she's the one hurting. Where was this energy when she mocked me last week? He ran a hand over his face, looking exhausted. I don't want to do this right now. No, of course you don't, I muttered. You never do. You'd rather keep the peace than stand up for your own daughter. Linda pushed her chair back, standing up abruptly. You're cruel, Sarah. You're bitter and cruel, and honestly it's sad. No wonder you don't have a family of your own. That one hit like a slap. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. You don't get to talk about family. You don't know the first thing about it. She scoffed. And you do? You're a miserable, pathetic woman clinging to the past. At least Baxter actually loved me. More than you can say about anyone in your life. I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. Go to hell, Linda. Then I walked out. Again. As I slammed the door behind me, my father didn't follow. He never did. I didn't go back home that night. After the argument with Linda, I drove straight to my best friend Rachel's apartment. She lived in a small but cozy place on the other side of town, and when she opened the door and saw my tear-streaked face, she didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me into a hug and said, "Stay as long as you need." I took her up on that offer. The next morning, my father called me. I let it go to voicemail, already knowing what he wanted. When I finally listened to the message, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Sarah, I need you to come home and apologize to Linda." I nearly laughed. Of course, that was what he cared about. Not how hurt I was. Not how cruel Linda had been to me. Just keeping the peace, just like always. I texted him back, "I'm not coming home. And I'm not apologizing." That was the last we spoke for weeks. Rachel was a lifesaver. She gave me space when I needed it but was always there when I felt like talking. And one night, after a couple of glasses of wine, I finally let everything spill out. "She spent years making me feel like I was crazy for mourning my own mother," I said, gripping my wine glass. "And then she loses a dog and expects the whole world to grieve with her? And my dad," I shook my head, my throat tightening. "He just lets her. Every single time." Rachel sighed, curling up on the couch next to me. "Honestly, I don't think he even realizes how much he's failing you. I scoffed. That doesn't make it better. No, it doesn't. But it means you have to stop waiting for him to change. He won't stand up for you, Sarah. You have to do it yourself. That conversation stuck with me. I had spent so many years trying to get my father to see my pain, to recognize how much Linda was hurting me. But he never did. And maybe he never would. A week later, I made an appointment with a therapist. At first, I wasn't sure if it would help. Talking about my feelings wasn't something I had ever been good at. But my therapist, Dr. Patel, had a way of making things make sense. Your father's passivity isn't about you, she said during one of our sessions. It's about his own inability to handle conflict. He's not choosing Linda over you. He's choosing the path of least resistance. That's not any better, I muttered. No, it's not. But understanding that means you can stop blaming yourself. You've spent years waiting for him to fight for you. Maybe it's time to stop waiting. She was right. For so long, I had been trying to get my father to defend me, to prove that I mattered. But the truth was, I didn't need his validation. What I needed was boundaries. So I made a decision. Instead of waiting for my father to wake up and see the damage he'd done, I took control of my own healing. I wrote a letter to Linda. I didn't do it for her. I did it for me. In the letter, I laid everything out. The years of subtle digs, the constant dismissal of my grief, the way she had made me feel like I was overreacting for loving my own mother. I told her that I was done trying to earn her respect, that I wasn't asking for permission to grieve, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let her make me feel small anymore. I didn't expect a response. Honestly, I didn't even know if she would read it. But a few days later, an envelope arrived at Rachel's apartment with my name on it. Inside was a short note. Just a few sentences. Sarah, I won't pretend I understand your grief, but I realize now that I handled things poorly. I'm sorry for that. I can't change the past, but I won't interfere with your mother's memory anymore. I hope you can find peace. That was it. No excuses. No defensiveness. Just an acknowledgement that, for the first time ever, she had heard me. And then, something even more unexpected happened. My father called. Not to ask me to apologize, not to guilt me into coming home. Just to talk. I started going to therapy, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. I should have done it a long time ago. I think I've been avoiding a lot of things. Especially when it comes to you. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm sorry, Sarah, he continued. I should have protected you. I see that now. It wasn't a perfect fix. It didn't erase years of pain. But for the first time, my father was taking responsibility. For the first time, I wasn't the one fighting alone. I never expected things to change between Linda and me. Even after my father's apology and her short note acknowledging that she had hurt me, I assumed we would remain in this strange, distant state, where we were civil for my father's sake but fundamentally separate, tolerating each other out of obligation rather than any real desire to mend what had been broken. I didn't trust that anything had truly shifted because people like Linda didn't just change overnight, and I had spent too many years resenting her to believe that one note could undo everything. Then, out of nowhere, I received a text from her, something so out of character that I had to reread it several times to make sure I wasn't imagining things. She asked if I would be willing to meet her for coffee, just to talk, and for a long time I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. The idea of sitting across from Linda in a casual setting, pretending we were just two people catching up instead of years-long adversaries, felt bizarre, and I didn't know whether to ignore her message or accept out of curiosity. When Rachel, my best friend, noticed my hesitation, she glanced at my phone and raised an eyebrow when she saw Linda's name, clearly as surprised as I was, and after a long moment of debating with myself, I told Linda I would meet her, if only to hear what she had to say. When I arrived at the small cafe we had agreed upon, I found Linda already seated by the window, a cup of tea in her hands and a look of mild discomfort on her face, which, I realized, was probably the closest she ever got to looking nervous. I sat across from her without saying much, waiting to see what she wanted, and after an awkward pause, she admitted that she had been thinking a lot about what I had written in my letter and had come to the difficult realization that she had treated me unfairly from the beginning. Her voice was measured and cautious, like she was afraid that saying the wrong thing might make me leave. But for the first time since I had known her, she actually seemed sincere. She told me that when Baxter had died, she had been overwhelmed by the support she received from others, and in that moment, she understood how much it must have hurt when I was denied the same compassion for grieving my own mother, and when she admitted that she had been cruel and hypocritical, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I had spent years resenting Linda, convinced that she was incapable of self-awareness, so to hear her not only acknowledge her behavior, but also express a desire to change was something I never expected, and though I wasn't ready to instantly forgive her, I told her that if she was truly willing to try, then I was too. That conversation was the first step, but I still wasn't sure how much I trusted her words until a few weeks later, when she approached me with a completely unexpected idea, suggesting that we plant a remembrance garden for my mother. At first, I thought she was joking, but when she explained that she wanted to do something to honor my mother's memory with me, I realized she was serious, and despite my reservations, I agreed. We spent an entire Saturday working side by side in the backyard, digging into the soil and planting flowers that my mother had loved, including lilies, hydrangeas, and daffodils, and for the first time, we weren't on opposite sides of a battle. At one point, as we paused to take a break, Linda sat back on her heels and, in an unusually quiet voice, asked if my mother would have liked what we were doing, and when I nodded, saying that she would have. I saw something soften in Linda's expression, as if she had finally allowed herself to see my mother as more than just an obstacle in her life. A week after we planted the garden, Linda took an even bigger step by asking me if she could accompany me to visit my mother's grave, and when I heard the words come out of her mouth, I was stunned into silence because I had spent so long believing she wanted nothing to do with my mother's memory, yet here she was, voluntarily offering to stand by my side as I visited the most sacred place I had left of my mother. Though I was hesitant at first, I agreed, and when we arrived at the cemetery, I placed fresh flowers on the headstone as I always did while Linda stood quietly beside me, not speaking until she finally whispered an apology to my mother, and in that moment, I knew that something had truly changed between us. Not long after, Linda surprised me yet again by asking if I would be willing to teach her some of my mother's old recipes so that we could cook together, and though the idea of sharing something so deeply personal with her was strange at first, I realized that this was her way of trying to connect with me in a way she never had before. We started with my mother's roast chicken, which had always been my favorite, and for the first time, Linda let me take the lead, carefully following my instructions and listening intently as I told her how my mother used to hum while she cooked and how she had a habit of sneaking me little tastes of food before it was officially ready. It was surreal to stand in the kitchen with the woman who had once tried to erase every trace of my mother from our home, now watching her make an effort to bring my mother's memory back to life, and when we finally sat down to eat, I could see the relief on my father's face as he took in the unexpected peace that had settled between us. The final step in our journey toward reconciliation came when my father suggested that we try family therapy together, and though I was skeptical, I agreed, knowing that if we were truly going to move forward, we needed to confront everything that had happened. Therapy was not easy, and there were plenty of difficult conversations where we had to unpack years of resentment and misunderstandings. But for the first time, Linda didn't dismiss my feelings or try to justify her past behavior. Instead, she admitted that she had been jealous, not of my mother herself, but of the love I had for her because she had never experienced that kind of connection in her own family, and rather than respecting what I had, she had resented it. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me, and for the first time, I saw her not as my enemy but as a deeply flawed person who had made terrible mistakes but was now genuinely trying to make amends. Though I wasn't sure if I would ever truly consider her family, I knew that something between us had shifted, and for the first time in years, we were no longer fighting. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it didn't erase the past, but it was real, and for the first time, that felt like enough. I never thought I would reach a point where I could honor my mother's memory without feeling the unbearable weight of grief pressing down on my chest. For years, every mention of her name, every reminder of what I had lost, had been like a fresh wound reopening. But somehow, through all the anger, resentment, and unexpected healing, I had arrived at a place where remembering her felt less like drowning and more like warmth, something I could carry with me instead of something that consumed me. It didn't happen overnight. Even after Linda and I started making efforts toward reconciliation, there were still moments where I felt the old bitterness creeping in, moments where I questioned whether she truly understood just how much she had hurt me. But something had changed, and I could feel it in the way she spoke about my mother now, not with dismissiveness or irritation, but with a quiet sort of respect. The real turning point came on the anniversary of my mother's death, a day that had always felt impossible to endure. For years, I had visited her grave alone, carrying my grief in silence, knowing that my father would avoid the conversation and that Linda would dismiss it as unnecessary. But this year was different. A week before the date, Linda approached me in the kitchen while I was making tea, clearing her throat in that awkward way she always did when she was trying to say something difficult. I turned to look at her, waiting, and after a long pause, she finally spoke. "I know this day has always been hard for you," she said carefully, as if she was afraid I might snap at her. "And I know I can't change that. But, if you want, your father and I would like to go with you this year. We want to be there for you." I stared at her, completely caught off guard. "You want to come with me?" I asked, half expecting her to backtrack. Linda nodded. "If you'll have us." I didn't know what to say. For so many years, I had carried this pain alone, convinced that neither of them cared enough to stand beside me in my grief. And now, Linda, of all people, was offering to be there. A part of me wanted to reject her, to say that she didn't deserve to be part of this after everything she had done. But another part of me, the part that had started to see her not as an enemy, but as someone trying to make amends, wanted to say yes. So I did. On the morning of the anniversary, we drove to the cemetery together. My father was quiet, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, as if he wasn't sure how to navigate this new reality. Linda sat in the backseat beside me, her usual sharp demeanor softened by something I couldn't quite name. When we arrived, I walked ahead, kneeling by my mother's grave as I always did, placing fresh lilies beside her name. For a long time, I just sat there, letting the silence settle around me, and for the first time, it didn't feel so lonely. My father stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, while Linda stood a few steps behind, her expression unreadable but respectful. Then, after a long moment, she did something I never expected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I wrote something, she said hesitantly, glancing between my father and me. I don't know if it's appropriate, but I wanted to say something to her. If that's okay. I felt my throat tighten. Linda, the woman who had once tried to erase every trace of my mother from our home, was now standing at her grave, asking permission to speak to her. I nodded. Go ahead. She unfolded the paper, cleared her throat, and began to read. I never met you, Helen, but I know how deeply you were loved. I know because I have seen the way Sarah carries you with her and everything she does. I know because I have seen the pain that losing you caused, and I know that I did not make it any easier. For that, I am sorry. I cannot change the past, but I want you to know that I will do my best to honor the love you left behind. You will not be forgotten. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the flowers. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me loosen, a tension I hadn't even realized I was still holding. Linda would never be my mother. She would never replace what I had lost. But in that moment, I realized she wasn't trying to. She was simply trying to be better. After that day, something shifted. For the first time, we started forming traditions, not as strangers forced to coexist, but as something closer to a family. We started cooking together more often, flipping through my mother's old recipe book and making the meals she had loved. Linda was clumsy in the kitchen, constantly misreading ingredients or setting the heat too high, but instead of growing frustrated, she laughed at herself, and for the first time, I laughed with her. We decided to make the Remembrance Garden a permanent part of our home, tending to it together and adding new flowers each year. Linda even suggested placing a small bench there so we could sit and talk, and when I saw her kneeling in the dirt, carefully pulling weeds and trimming the plants, I realized that she wasn't just doing this for me. She was doing it for herself, too. Then, in another unexpected turn, Linda began volunteering at a local grief support group. At first, I thought I had misheard her when she mentioned it at dinner one evening, but she explained that after everything she had learned through our therapy sessions, she wanted to help others who were struggling with loss. I used to think grief was something you had to push through, she admitted, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. But I was wrong. I see that now. And if I can help someone else feel less alone, then maybe it's worth something. It was strange, seeing her like this, open, vulnerable, willing to acknowledge her past mistakes. The woman who had once dismissed my grief was now helping others navigate their own, and I realized that, somehow, we had both changed. She would never be my mother, and I would never love her the way I loved my mother, but I no longer needed to fight against her presence in my life. She was part of it now, not as a replacement but as something else entirely. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching the sunset over the Remembrance Garden, Linda turned to me with a hesitant expression. I know I can't undo the past, she said quietly. And I know I'll never be your mother. But do you think maybe we could be family in our own way? I thought about it for a long moment. She would never be the mother I lost, and she would never fill that space in my heart. But maybe she didn't need to. Maybe what we had now, this understanding, this respect, was enough. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I felt no resentment. No anger. Just peace. Yeah, I said, finally nodding. I think we can.